be talking about heaven as well. And fingers crossed, back in Revelation by the end of the day. We'll see how that goes. Last week we talked about, because we ran out of time, towards the end, and we didn't get a chance to ask questions, so I said, homework, if you have any questions, just write those down, and we can pick up back with our discussion with your questions. So was there anything that we didn't get a chance to discuss in yesterday's, last week's talk about Hades that we need to take another look at today?
Dan, we never got to Tartarus. What was Tartarus?
Tartarus is it's something mentioned in one of Peter's letters, and it is a prison for fallen angels. It's a prison for fallen angels. There's debate on why this particular group of fallen angels or demons are kept in prison, whereas normal demons aren't, and they're free to roam around. I'm trying to decide if how much of a tangent we want to go on there, but why not? Okay. Okay. I think it's in Genesis 6. I'll pop over there and see if I can find it real quick. Yeah. The question, the debate, centers on Genesis 6. And it says, starting in verse 1, when mankind began to multiply on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of mankind were beautiful, and they took any they chose as wives for themselves. And the Lord said, my spirit will not remain with mankind forever, because they are corrupt. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on earth both in those days and afterward. When the sons of God came to the daughters of mankind who bore children to them, they were the powerful men of old, the famous men. So the question is, who are these Nephilim? It says, back in verse 4, the Nephilim were on earth both in those days and afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of mankind who bore children to them. One theory is that that phrase, sons of God, refers to angels, and that the angels came down to earth, cohabited with women, and they bore crossbreeds, children that were half men and half angels. And for this sin, those angels were locked, well, angels, fallen angels, demons, those demons were locked in a pit called Tartarus. There are people who disagree with that theory. That is the one that I tend to focus on. The other interpretation they'll give is that the sons of God in Genesis 6 refers to the sons of Seth. And again, I don't want to go too far off field here. I would just point out that back in the New Testament, when it makes reference to this, well, and I'm not prepared to do that. I probably shouldn't have started down here. You have a, Ben, do you know where that Tartarus was? It's somewhere, I think, in 2 Peter, but I don't have the...
Yeah, it is... I just had it. There you go. 2 Peter 2:4.
2:4, okay.
For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to, and it just says hell, putting them into gloomy dungeons to be held for judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others, if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes and made them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued Lot, a righteous man who was distressed by the filthy lives of the lawless man, for that righteous man living among them day after day was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard. If this is so, then the Lord God knows how to rescue godly men from trials and to hold the unrighteous for the day of judgment while continuing their punishment.
Okay. So what that tells us is that for some reason, the Bible doesn't specify here in 2 Peter, but there is a class of angels, fallen angels, demons, who are thrown into Tartarus, whereas we know that there are obviously demons that are free to roam today. In fact, the devil is free to roam today. So the question is, well, if even the devil is able to move around, what in the world did these angels do that God said they're too dangerous to allow access to the world, and they're in this place called Tartarus today? I would suggest that it goes back to that Genesis 6 story we just read, and I apologize, there is a verse that connects the two. I'm unprepared at this point in time to remember what that was. I'll have to see if I can find that for next week. But that's just my suggestion, that that was the sin that got them cast into Tartarus. I'll have to look into that. Does anyone have a pen? I need to write that down. So I can... Thank you. Nope. All right. All right, so we're 0 for 1 on the questions. Any others?
Yeah, you may have covered this last week, and I just didn't remember. So what, in the 2 different models that were up there, what was the evidence for Old Testament people going to Hades and the holding room? You may have covered that, I'm sorry.
Nope, that's fine. Old Testament evidence that the wicked went to Hades, Psalm 9:17. Was one. I've got about 4 of them here.
What was it? Psalm?
Psalms 9:17.
But what about them Old Testament folks going to the Hades or whatever the holding room is, and then going to heaven?
And then going to heaven.
The righteous ones.
Yeah, that one is Ephesians 4, 8, and 9, and that is a contested verse. There is a sharp division among scholars. Originally, in the early days of the church, it was interpreted to mean that Christ did descend. If someone who's at Ephesians 4, 8, 9 wants to reread that for us, that would be cool.
When he ascended on high, he led the captives in his train and gave gifts to men. 9. What does he ascended mean, except that he descended to the lower earthly regions?
Okay. When the church was younger, that was taken to mean that Christ actually did go into hell, preached the good news to them, and that he took the people, the saved people, out of the paradise compartment of Hades and lifted them up to heaven. That was a common view in the early church. In modern times, it's kind of flipped, and that's harder to find people that support that point of view. Most people will now say that the verse that Logan read teaches that when it says that he descended, it doesn't mean he descended into hell. When it says he descended into the lower parts of the earth, it should be taken as he descended into the lower parts of the universe, i.e. the earth, which he did at his incarnation. The Greek grammar is inconclusive at that point, and so there's no way of telling conclusively which one is correct. We just have to see which one better fits evidence in the rest of the Bible. And as I said, people are divided on that.
Well, mainly where my question was going is, like, I never understood how people in the Old Testament, if they ever made it to heaven, beyond the ones that were raptured. Well, I guess I assumed the raptured ones right there.
Say that one more time for me.
I never understood where it said anybody living in the Old Testament, how they went to heaven, if they did.
Okay. The Old Testament itself didn't really address that question. If you were a Jew living in the Old Testament time, you didn't know nearly as much about heaven or hell as we do today. Most of that comes from the New Testament. Pretty much all the Old Testament saints knew is that there would be a resurrection, that they were right with God. How that was going to work out, the details of that were largely unknown to them. There is no clear answer as to what happened to the Old Testament saints when they died. Some people believe that they went into Hades, into that blessed compartment of Hades. That was the teaching, for instance, of the Roman Catholic Church, which would have been powerful in the early years of the church, and that's where they get the idea of limbo. That was what they would have called limbo. That's where the Old Testament saints were, because their argument was they can't go to heaven because in the Old Testament time, Jesus hadn't died, payment hadn't been made for sin, so they couldn't be in the presence of God yet. So you had to come up with an idea that allowed them to be free from torment, to be in paradise but not in heaven, and that's where this idea of the blessed compartment of Hades came from. The other point of view would be that
when you say idea, that sounds to me like it's a man-made creation.
It is. Yeah, you're right, it is. As I said, if we're just looking at the evidence of the Bible, there really isn't anything in the Old Testament to answer that question. So scholars have had to say, okay, we don't have a lot of evidence, we don't have a lot of details. What can we do just based off of logic? And there are different conclusions that people have come up with. The other one, if you don't like the Hades one, some people would say, well, God let those Old Testament saints into heaven, even though Christ hadn't died yet for their sins. He still let them into heaven on the basis of that future sacrifice. But again, the Bible doesn't say that either. So
No answer.
What was the criteria that, like, you made enough sacrifices and atonements, or?
well, faith in God is always what's been what has saved us. Whether you're talking Old Testament or New Testament, faith in God connects us to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. We aren't in any confusion today what happens, because the New Testament sheds light on that. So I don't want it to be a source of confusion for us. Today it's clear what happens to us when we die. It was not clear to the Old Testament saints what happened. And so we're speculating, but in one regard it doesn't actually matter, because when Christ died, the Old Testament's blood, the Old Testament saints were covered by the blood of Christ, and so now everyone is in heaven. Regardless, so let me just summarize, because this is getting confusing, I know. Regardless of which of the two styles that you went with last week, the two models, today, on this side of the cross, when you die, if you are covered by the blood of Christ, you go to heaven, heaven. And if you are not covered by the blood of Christ, you go down to Hades or hell. That we're certain of. We're not certain of what happened back in the Old Testament times. There wasn't enough information. We are certain what happens today. So. But like, going back to your point, it is speculation, but there are little details, like in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, which happened in Old Testament times, well, intertestamental times, they're able to talk to each other. And so you say, okay, can I generalize from that? Is that enough information for me to make a decision on?
Really, I was just wondering, did anybody go to heaven that lived before Christ?
By heaven, you mean heaven?
Eventually, yes. And that maybe it's just not known, and that's easy to accept. That's fine.
Yeah, I would say that no one knows for certain.
Yeah.
Elijah was taken up.
Well, beyond the rapture.
Yeah, beyond like Elijah. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good point. That would give evidence that he was caught up to heaven.
And then, well, I was thinking the Transfiguration, but because Moses and Elijah appeared, and Moses died, but we don't know, was he in a nice part of Hades, or was brought to the mountain and Transfiguration, or no? That did not conclude one way or the other.
Old Testament wasn't conclusive, so I apologize for that. I do have an answer back on the angel thing, because I've been multitasking here. So the verse I was looking for was in Jude 6. Jude 6. These angels, and I'll just read this real quick. Again, Jude 6, if you want to flip over there and take a look. It says, and he, that is God, he has kept with eternal chains in darkness for the judgment of the great day the angels who did not keep their own position, but deserted their proper dwelling. Okay, so that's the discussion of those angels. But here it gives more information, because in verse 7 it follows up with that and says, in the same way. In the same way. Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them committed sexual immorality. So that means that whoever these angels are that got cast into Tartarus, whatever their sin was, it was in the same way as Sodom and Gomorrah's sexual sins. It doesn't specify what those sexual sins were, but the fact that angels are capable, even though they don't marry, the Bible says angels don't marry, they are able to commit sexual sins, and that would seem to suggest the sin mentioned in Genesis 6. So there you go. All right.
Well, in Genesis 6, though, mine says, and they married. So is that just the...
Where was that at? What verse?
6:2. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Is that just the...
That could be a euphemism.
Yeah, my older version of it, NIV says the same thing.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, old version too.
Well, the new one says that, but I thought that we were talking about verse 4.
You're right. So, again, not everyone agrees with that, but I can't get past Jude 6. It does say that in some way angels were committing sexual sins. That seems strange to think about, that angels could do that, but that's what it says. So is that the same sexual sin as we read in Genesis 6? The Bible doesn't say that, but logically I look at it, okay, we know from Jude 6 there's a sexual sin that they were thrown into Tartarus for. Genesis 6 records a sexual sin. Are they the same? Without any other evidence, I would say that's the best theory I have. It's not a proof. I can't be dogmatic on that, but that is the best fit for that theory that I've come across. That the angels did come down, some of them, fallen angels, had sex with the daughters of men, and they gave birth to a crossbreed, the Nephilim, this half angel, half man, that became powerful, and as a result, God cast those angels into a special place of punishment.
So he cast the angels into punishment, and the Nephilim were just destroyed in the flood?
That would be my understanding, yeah. Yeah, not everyone would agree with that, but unless there's some other theory that fits the evidence better, and you might come across one I have not. Any others? Any others from last week? So what I'd like to finish on then is the question, are there different levels of reward in heaven? You and I are covered by the blood of Christ. We're all going to be in heaven. Will we all have the same level of reward, or will we have different levels of reward? And the flip side of that, the people in hell, are there going to be different levels of punishment? Will some people's tenure in torment be harsher than others? And it's interesting to me, I brought with me probably the most influential book on the subject is not the Bible, but this one. This is Dante's Divine Comedy. It contains what's called the Inferno. And most of what we know, or think we know, about hell and heaven actually doesn't come from the Bible. It comes from a fictional source. Dante was an Italian. He wrote in the 1300s, and it's just amazing. In fact, go off on a little tangent here, because why not? I am a big video game player, and I was playing a video game called Fallout, and it's set in the post-apocalyptic ruins of Washington, D.C., where you can explore the Museum of Natural History. And right before the bombs fell, they had an exhibit on hell. And so everything is hell-themed in this Museum of Natural History. And the name of the restaurant in the museum is called the Ninth Circle. So even though this book was written 700 years ago, it's still influencing pop culture today. It's influencing theology today. And what Dante believed was that there were 9 circles of hell. And that depending on how gross your sins were, God would have this heavenly sorting machine, and he would deposit you in the correct circle of hell. So if you were a light sinner, didn't do too bad of things, you might be lucky enough to end up in the first circle. If you were a really terrible person, like Judas Iscariot, you would end up in the 9th circle of hell. And then, you know, if you were kind of in the middle, you'd get put in one of the others. Also, on a side note, I can't resist, probably shouldn't say this, but I'm going to. He wrote about famous people that he saw. He didn't just stick to generalities. He would actually put actual living people in his story, including 3 popes. 3 popes are in hell. And you might think, well, that's just a Protestant Catholic bashing. He wrote in the 1300s. When was the Protestant Reformation?
1500s.
200 years. So everyone's Catholic. There is no other choice. Everyone's Catholic. At that time, it's an interesting peek into history because today we think of, you know, popes as infallible and you know, essentially living saints. Back then, they didn't believe that. The Catholic Church will tell you that they did, but the proof is right here. They had Catholics writing about popes burning in hell. It's an interesting little point there. By name.
I'm assuming the Catholics do not take that as...
Well, it's just a work of fiction.
Right.
So it's not like it's endorsed by the Catholic Church.
Right.
But it just goes to show the common view at the time was not what the Catholic Church says it is.
Was he...
Excommunicated?
No.
No?
No, that was not, again, don't want to get too off.
Okay. Yeah.
I'll go a little further off, because if you're going to wreck the train, you might as well do it spectacularly. There was one pope before Dante wrote who was very upset with one of his predecessors, and so he actually dug up the corpse of the pope, previous pope, put him on trial, literally on a throne, this decaying skeleton sitting on a throne, and has a court hearing. It was called the Cadaver Synod, and would like literally ask him questions to this corpse, and they'd have someone answer in behalf of the corpse. Was found guilty. They officially, the pope who was trying, the deceased pope, officially nullified all of the former pope's ordinations, which causes huge problems in Catholic theology, and then tossed the pope's body into the Tiber River. I mean, it's very different what the Catholic Church looked like in the Middle Ages as today. So, anyway, for what it's worth. All right, anyway, back to what we're talking about. Clearly, in popular thinking, there is different levels of punishment in hell. But most of that has been influenced, to be honest, by this work of fiction. Is there any truth to that? Does the Bible give any support to the idea that there's different levels of punishment, or is it simply a product of the very influential Dante Alighieri that has spread this into our culture? And to answer that question, I would suggest the answer is yes, but it is very, very light. So I found 2 verses, and we'll take a look at that. If you want to flip to, let's see if I can find that there. There it is, Matthew, in the book of Matthew. I'll need one person to flip to Matthew chapter 10.
Get that one.
And if someone else would go next door to Matthew 11, that would be good. So Matthew 10, and you'll recognize this as soon as we say it. Matthew chapter 10, if someone would like to read verses 11 to 15, this is Jesus speaking.
Whatever town or village you enter, search for some worthy person there and stay at his house until you leave. As you enter the home, give it your greeting. If the home is deserving, let your peace rest on it. If it is not, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet when you leave that hometown. I tell you the truth, it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. I am sending you out like sheep among wolves, therefore be as shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. I wonder if there's a paragraph.
My paragraph ended with 15. I don't know
Yeah,
what
mine
meant.
too.
Even the message could get that right. Come on. I assure you it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah. We'll keep that in our minds. And then in chapter 11, right next door, very similar, very similar. Someone would like to pick up verses 20 to 24.
Then Jesus began to denounce the towns in which most of his miracles had been performed because they did not repent. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre or Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, it would be more bearable in Tyre and Sidon for the day of judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, for you will you be lifted to the heavens? No, you will go down to Hades. For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Sodom, it would have remained to this day. But I tell you that it will be more bearable for Sodom on the day of judgment than for you.
So in those two passages, what have we noticed?
There's a difference in punishment.
It says on the day of judgment, and they list a few different towns, these towns will have it better off than these towns. So what does that imply? There's apparently going to be a difference in judgment. Again, it's not a whole lot of detail, is it? But it does imply that there will be at least some differing levels of punishment. And then from there, Dante comes up with 9 different circles. Very detailed, very detailed. So there you go. That's what the Bible has to say.
Was Sodom and Gomorrah, did they use the word judgment, or did God just wipe them out?
I'm sorry, I don't think I understand that.
Well, it says on the day of judgment. So did Sodom and Gomorrah have a day of judgment, or were they just wiped out?
Okay, I would suggest that the day of judgment they're referring to is the day when everyone's judged, the great white throne.
Right.
So they've already been wiped out. So is that the judgment? I would say no, that the judgment's still coming.
Okay.
That raises an interesting question, though, of are you judged by the town you live in?
Well, I think they went, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I said when Sodom and Gomorrah was judged, the challenge was given,
Right.
if you can find one person, God will say, if I find 10, but if you can find
Right.
one, I will spare the city. So it makes me think that he would do throughout the whole town, looking for
Right.
one. So nothing.
No.
It's on individual merit, just Sodom and Gomorrah was so bad that there was none.
Right.
Well, in Tyre, it's an interesting reference there. Back in Ezekiel, it talks about that the king of Tyre was, it starts off as a man, but then it translates over into Satan, if I'm remembering that right, Dan. So they're saying that it would be better for a town that was ruled by Satan if they had seen the miracles that Christ performed. That town would have been better off than these towns filled with the Jewish elite of the day. So that really kind of puts those people in perspective.
And just as a point on that, the question was raised, is God punishing an entire nation or does God punish individuals? I would suggest that first and foremost, we're all responsible for our own individual actions and that God judges us as individuals. Having said that, God also judges nations as whole. For instance, Israel. And what happened to Israel in the Old Testament times? God was, both in the period of the judges, he was judging Israel. The Babylonian and Assyrian invasions were judgments on Israel. Does that mean all of Israel was bad? A majority were. Most of the people in Israel had moved away from God. There were holy people still there that were following God. And so those people on the day of judgment are going to be saved, the ones who had true faith in God. But the nation that they were in, because the nation as a whole was guilty, the nation was punished. So God does judge nations and individuals in different manners. We all have to answer for ourselves individually, but it is also true, God does judge nations as a whole, and that should give us some pause when we think about our country, America. God does deal with nations on national levels. And we read in Daniel that both he and apparently the evil one also have emissaries. God has sent Michael, for example, the book of Daniel teaches, to be the angel assigned to Israel to help them, and the devil also sends demons. So there are these behind-the-scenes, spiritual level, these emissaries to the different nations that have some sort of spiritual influence on them. So it's all fascinating to me, but the Bible doesn't give as much information and details as I would like on that. Thoughts, questions?
So is that where the Catholics get the idea of different levels of sin also? Is by Dante's work of the different levels of hell, or circles of hell?
I can't speak to that. It's my understanding that, no, that the difference between mortal and venial sins would have occurred before Dante wrote in the 14th century. I'm pretty sure, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that was in place long before Dante wrote. I don't know the exact year that came out. It's difficult because if you ask a Catholic, they would say, well, this has always been our belief because it was handed down from Peter, right? Because they can't say we're coming up with new stuff. Like papal infallibility, when did Catholics first believe the Pope could make a mistake on matters of faith and morals? Was in 1870. 1870, relatively recently. But if you ask that, they say, well, no, that was just when it was officially declared. We've always believed that in some form.
And what about the one that was judged for and everything that he ever said or did?
They don't know about that, probably, right? I'm sure they don't teach that in CCB.
Yeah, I was gonna ask my carpool about it.
Yeah, I'm
because I
sure
was told
you
not to.
would.
I was advised better, which I'm sure that it is better.
That's about, I'm not.
The-
About the
cadaver
the
trial.
example you just gave,
Yeah.
like, could I ever trial? Because if you believe in the Pope not being able to sin, why would
No,
they do that?
I want to be clear, it doesn't say the Pope can't sin it. Infallibility means when he is speaking authoritatively from his position as Pope, he cannot make a mistake on matters of faith or morals. He cannot teach falsely on a matter of faith or morals. It doesn't mean he personally can't sin. It means he can't make a mistake on matters of
So is the
faith or
Pope
morals.
arguing that he wasn't speaking from his
That's
papal position,
ex
whatever?
cathedra, they call it ex cathedra. That is what they would say. They would say, well, it's in.
So he puts the hat on.
It reminds me of a game of Simon Says, because when I was a child, we'd play Simon Says. How many people play Simon Says, right? And so you can have someone that says, for instance, stand up. And sometimes when you hear stand up, you're supposed to say stand up. You're supposed to stand up, and sometimes you're not supposed to stand up. And the only difference between that is if you attach the magic little words, Simon Says. And so the Pope, throughout history, has made declarations on matters of faith, but it's only if the magic words ex cathedra are added to it, that he's using his official position and speaking authoritatively, that those are believed to be infallible. The problem with that is, for centuries before this was declared, in the Middle Ages, for example, that doctrine was unknown. So if you were an everyday Catholic and the Pope says something, you wouldn't have questioned that. You wouldn't have said, oh, but he's not doing it ex cathedra, he didn't say Simon Says. You would trust the Pope is speaking. You wouldn't necessarily make that distinction. And so what they've done is they've kind of gone backwards now and said, well, all the times the popes have been wrong in the past, it was because he didn't say Simon Says. And that's their kind of backwards way of getting around things that they'll do.
So they would say that the Pope that was on trial never said Simon Says.
That would be a direct quote from the Vatican, yes. And it was later overturned. The conviction of the corpse was overturned by future popes.
So they
So
go
then
fish
they
them out.
pull
So
of the
then the Pope that did
They
the
did.
trial was then wrong.
The Pope who did the trial was Stephen VII. He was, there was a lot of outrage among the people that a former Pope had been dug up and put on trial. So they arrested that Pope, put him in jail, and strangled him.
That was nice.
And then the Pope that replaced him forgave the cadaver Pope. And everything was fine until then the Pope after him reversed everything, reconvicted the cadaver Pope, and pardoned the Pope that had been leading, Stephen, yeah. So,
Sounds like a
no,
soap
I'm making this
opera.
up. You can, literally, you can Wikipedia that. Just look up cadaver synod. You can read it for yourself there. It's interesting.
Too bad there wasn't TV back then, you could put that on TV.
Yeah, that would,
Trial of the
Soap
century.
opera.
yeah.
Okay. Well, we've talked about different levels of punishment in hell. The Bible suggests it, just in passing. We don't have a lot of details, and to be honest, that's probably for the best that we don't. Is there a corresponding level of rewards in heaven?
Yes.
Well, let's take a look. Let's take a look. If you would like to take a look at, we're getting a little low on time, so let's jump to 1 Corinthians 3. This is the big one. The one place in the Bible we have more information than any other place about rewards in heaven. Not talking about salvation, that's important. Everyone who believes in Christ is saved as an act of mercy and grace. We're talking about, are we rewarded for the things that we do in this life? Salvation is a gift. Rewards are for actions that we have committed. So 1 Corinthians chapter 3, if someone would like to read verses 11 to 15.
For no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. If any man builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, his work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each man's work. If what he has built survives, he will receive his reward. If it is burned up, he will suffer loss. He himself will be saved, but only as one escaping through the flames.
Or as we would say, an English idiom, by the skin of your teeth. So we've got different works. Back in verse 12, it says your works can be gold, silver, costly stones, all those good things. Or then it says they could be wood, hay, or straw, worthless building materials. It's going to be tested by fire. And then in verse 14, if anyone's work he has built survives the testing, the fire, he will receive a reward. But if anyone's burned up, the reward is lost, but he himself is saved. And that's important to notice. We're not talking about salvation here. And it explicitly states that. We're talking about rewards earned or lost.
Does that mean you get a shack in heaven instead of the Taj Mahal?
I don't clean the house I have. I wouldn't want a Taj Mahal. The place would be filthy. Probably no dust in heaven. No dust in heaven. Okay.
Dust is the work of the devil.
Dust is just dead skin, and there's no death. There you go.
There you go, take that. Take that. Scientist.
There you go. There's also dust mites and dust mite excrement, but there we go.
Well, you wouldn't have dust mites.
Would we have animals in heaven? Okay, we're getting off track again.
We digress.
Will there be, we're discussing if there's going to be dust in heaven. That's good, Dan. That's
Very
good.
theological.
That's what I planned for in my notes here. That's bullet point number 17. Okay. All right. Any questions or thoughts on that?
I think also the parable of the talents kind of points to that as well. He's put in charge of lots of things, so you could say he's rewarded for taking what was given and multiplying it.
But that's more talking on the earthly side of things, isn't it, than it is on the talents.
That was in the sermon, was it last week, 2 weeks ago?
No, is it?
Isn't that more on the earthly side of things, that God will give you
Based on
more
the
things based on what you can participate in?
Based on the context, I would argue that that would be a millennial context, that based on how we do with our resources now will influence how much influence we have during the millennial kingdom. That would be a premillennial interpretation. And the church would not agree with that, but that's how I would perceive it.
How would the church do it?
You would have to ask the church. I can't speak for them. Probably, well, I don't want to speculate. Don't want to, just won't speculate. What I will say in 1 Corinthians is I still have questions. I mean, this does seem to indicate there will be different levels of rewards. I want to ask questions about that. I want to ask, well, how do I get the good rewards? What do I need to, what does God expect me to do? And we can kind of speculate about, I mean, it's not in this particular context, but doing things that Christ would want us to do, right? The way we act towards other people, being kind, certainly evangelizing, doing the things that God wants us to do. And then something Chris brought up, kind of jokingly, but I think it's a good point. In what form will those rewards manifest? Is it really a bigger house in heaven? Doesn't seem likely that it would be something material like that, but we don't know. It doesn't say. So intriguing, get a little bit of information, but where you've got more questions to follow it.
Is this really about rewards or about the other people that you'll be a witness to that'll then be in heaven as well?
Well, maybe that's the way that the rewards manifest themselves. Maybe that is your reward, is seeing all the people that you worked hard for and that you shared the gospel with and seeing them in paradise with you. Maybe that's the way the reward manifests.
Because that's what it makes me think at the end when it says that it'll be burned up and you'll be on your own. You'll be the only one escaping. The people that you didn't witness to well enough would not be escaping.
I think that's certainly a valid interpretation.
Not everyone has a lifetime of Christ in their lives. So how could you put up there, accept Christ an hour before they pass?
I think that goes back to the talent story that Logan was sharing. God gives some people 10 talents. God gives some people maybe 1 talent. Maybe you were converted just a few years and you don't have much to work with. But in the story of the talents, what did the master expect from each person, regardless of whether they got 1, 5, or 10 talents?
To do their most work.
Maximize it.
Whatever you got. The person that got 1 talent, presumably, if he had just earned 1 more talent, he would have been okay. Because the guy that got 5 and 10, that's what they did. So it's not a matter of volume, I think, as whatever God does give you, and that does vary for each of us. Are you using it as you should be?
Or, but if you do consider like the person who, like, comes to Christ just before they pass away, just before they die, maybe that's the person who's being saved by the snare of the thief or is escaping through the flames.
So a lot of times I think that, you know, that last hour or so, but how many times did they reject God before that? How many times did they say no before that?
Yeah, does that 1 hour salvation still receive the same grace as?
We have to remember that God is just and He knows.
He knows the story.
Yeah, He knows the story. He knows if your salvation was genuine. And well, it seems to be that there are rewards in heaven. He's going to distribute those justly as well.
However, you don't want to be like the bigger brother from the prodigal son that, like as Christians that have been Christians for so long, we don't want to say, well, we're going to have better rewards than the person that just came to Christ.
Just don't know.
Yeah.
But if you read the prodigal son, it seems like we will be.
It seems like we should just be grateful that they came and that should be our reward.
Yeah.
Well, there's lots of examples of that, like that, and I can't remember what it is, the wages, where someone worked agreed to this wage, and you worked all day, and then someone came at the end of the day and worked the last couple hours, and they got paid the same amount. And they were upset, because, well, why should they make the same much as we did? We worked all day. Was your wages not agreeable when you started? It shouldn't matter what. So I think that's where the heart is.
Some people connect that to the Jews being the ones who worked all day and then the Gentiles being the ones who came later too. I've heard it described that way, but I've done enough looking to say one or the other.
Anyone else?
Were there other verses about levels in heaven? I think you mentioned there were a few.
There are other verses we can look at that describe that there is going to be judgment that we could look at, but they don't go into the detail of 1 Corinthians. They just say there is going to be a judgment, that Christians are going to be judged, which we could look at.
I just didn't know if there were any other verses that talked about the different.
Not that I'm aware of, no. That I'm aware of. Anyone else? Ladies and gentlemen, for next week, would you please read Revelation chapter 4. We are back. Yes, we are. We are back. Revelation 4, maybe 5. I'm going to be I'm gonna be a little daring. I'm gonna be daring. So if you've got the time, and you can get 5 read as well, that'd be great. I don't know if we'll be able to do 2 chapters in 1 week, but by golly, we'll be prepared and we're gonna do our best. Okay. Would anyone like to close us?